The South doesn't have a Navy, the Union has the Navy. The South defends its coastline largely through kind of more passive defenses, torpedoes they were called. These were underwater mines. Now I know we're all thinking, at least I used to think that when Admiral Farragut said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." I mean, that sounds like World War II to me, but okay, I'm a northerner, Westerner I should say. But what he was talking about were the torpedoes that did blow up numerous Union ships trying to infiltrate into the South. In fact, that was at the Battle of Mobile Bay, and that was the ship in front of him. Admiral Farragut sailing into Mobile Bay, and a ship blows up and sinks in a matter of moments. And he says, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." So these were things that they had to get around. And so the problem when they went into Fort Sumter in April of 1863 is that the torpedoes hung them up, and then they got raked by artillery fire from Fort Sumter, and they had to turn around, although one ship, a brand new ship, was sunk. In fact, by the way, that was the ship, I believe, that Robert Smalls was captaining at the time, or he was the pilot on that ship. So Robert Smalls appears everywhere. He just keeps popping up, but, well, not here, but I'm talking about. So they had, and this, by the way, is a picture of one of those torpedoes. They were very lethal, and especially in a black water river, they could not be seen. They're, moored in such a way that unless you know where they are, you don't know where they are. So this is why I think, even though the military record does not show that the intelligence was developed for this raid, and in fact, often when the raid is talked about, there is some indication by a reporter that there was kind of a spontaneous change of plans, and the Montgomery was going to go somewhere else, and then they decided to go up this river instead. So, here's this real danger, and I think it's not very likely as a historian, I think any military person would confirm, that it's not likely that you would prepare for an amphibious assault with 300 men on a spontaneous notion without knowing what you might encounter on that river. They could have only done this with excellent intelligence. So I think it's very historically likely, plausible, that somebody found where the torpedoes were anchored. Somebody discovered that the Confederates had temporarily withdrawn their heavy artillery from the mouth of the Columbia River. Somebody may well have deduced that the pickets were undermanned because of the change in the seasons. It started to get really hot, and the vapors were coming up, and so they were drawing down the people at the mouth of the river. And somebody may have also found out that actually the commander assigned to that army of 2,000 men camped nearby had a reputation as a slacker. He wasn't drilling his men. So some of the Negroes on shore might have had that information. And so I think it's entirely possible that somebody put this all together, sent it up the chain of command, and then guided the gunships once the attack was undertaken. And likely that was somebody with a team of Negro scouts. Harriet Tubman was in command of such a troop, or at least so she claimed on her military pension application. This was a military pension application. It was a common thing to do if you had served, especially if you'd served in any unofficial role with the U.S. Army, which all black people were in an unofficial role until the formation of troops was authorized and people began to be uniformed and that kind of thing. So much of what we know about Tubman's involvement in the raid comes from her pension application, and also from her autobiography, which was written a couple of years, not long after the Civil War. Now, by the way, the details are sparse. She tells, it's a page or two, she tells the story of the Columbia raid. She does not describe, as they say in the CIA, the sources and methods. She doesn't go into detail about how exactly it unfolded, and nor would one necessarily expect that. But what she does tell us corroborates what we know from some other sources. So there are eyewitnesses accounts of that other people tell. There's a General Apthorpe who was, another commander, a captain under Colonel James Montgomery. By the way, when people tell stories, they usually tell it from their point of view. I did this, and then I did that. And so they don't necessarily mention other people. We're not to deduce from that that those other people didn't exist. What we're to deduce from that is that people are people, and they tell their part of a story. So Harriet Tubman told her part of a story in an autobiography that was never contradicted in her lifetime. It was the most widely published description of the Columbia River raid, never contradicted, and in fact, in the autobiography, it shored up with statements by commanding officers that she was a person who was a very valuable scout. So this is the raid itself. And June 1st, 1863, in the late evening, after dark, 3 ships set out from the wharf that's right nearby this church. 3 ships set out. This is not the very ship, by the way. This is called the Maple Leaf. Ignore that. You know, in your mind, call it the Sentinel. Or you could call it the Harriet Reed, or you could call it the John Adams. Anyway, but I don't have pictures of them, so you get this. And they set out from this thing. After a short time, or after several hours, around dawn, they began to come up the Combahee River. And this is what they are seeing. They are seeing people who are working in the fields, in the rice fields. And again, you know this better than most people do. This is what the rice fields would have looked like. You know, partially covered in water. Some of them on higher ground would be drier. Anyway, the 3 ships sail after dark, and they begin to see people on shore by dawn. Now, by the way, not only are they seeing people, but they're also being seen. And one of the planters, whose plantation was to be burned down, he spies women on the top deck of the flagship. Now, he says women, but I think he saw somebody in a skirt. We don't know that there were any other women on board. Sometimes, again, if you're guessing, I see a skirt. Are there women on board? So he sees them on the top deck of the flagship. Maybe he's seeing Harriet Tubman. The other thing that they're seeing is that they're seeing these ships come up, and as Planter Hayward says, Colonel Hayward, he sees them angle around the torpedoes. Now, by the way, nobody can see the torpedoes, but he knows where they are because he's got to get up and down that river, right? You know, he's up and down that river. His people are up and down that river. He knows where the torpedoes are, and he sees the ships angle around unseen torpedoes. The other thing that Joshua Nichols noticed is that some of the people, when they get up there, a lot of the people, of course, are just shocked and surprised, and the enslaved people start streaming towards the water and towards the boats. But he notices that some of them are not surprised. Why are they not surprised? That's odd. Well, maybe it's because someone's infiltrated upriver and alerted some people to be ready for this raid. That seems kind of a logical thing to have happened. So in this military pension that Harriet Tubman talks about and in her autobiography, she discusses the events of the Combahee River Raid. It's never contradicted by anybody else. And one of the other things she mentions about this, and by the way, this is the picture of the raid. That is the only picture we have drawn by Harpers Weekly, and you've all seen throughout many places in Beaufort, I've noticed pictures that are from Harpers Weekly of the era. And when we think about the significance of the raid, by the way, it's easy to think, especially because you're local people, often we think the things that happen in our town are probably kind of small potatoes, you know, a little bit, you know, it's like, it's our town, so it can't be very important. I always love the phrase, you know, an expert is anyone from out of town. We never believe that our people are really expert, right? So this is the context for this picture, our only picture of the Combahee River Raid. It's on this page of Harpers Weekly. Now, this is one of the most famous pictures ever to appear in Harpers Weekly. This picture of this man named Gordon, you see him in the center. This is one of the most infamous pictures of slavery because it shows a man whose back is so torn up that he has these countless scars across his back. Now, the whole story, by the way, is that on the left, he arrives having escaped from slavery into Union lines. He's dressed in rags, basically. He's brought into the regiment. A doctor examines him to see if he's fit for duty, and it's the doctor who sees this back, and the picture is taken. And on the right, of course, he's transformed into a soldier, dressed in the Union Army uniform. And the Combahee River Raid was about that. It was about freeing people who had been misused and ill-treated and bringing them in and giving them a chance to bear arms in defense of not only their freedom, but of freedom in general. So later in Harriet Tubman's life, this, by the way, is General James Montgomery, the man who led the raid. This, to me, is also one last little piece of evidence. She says that he was selected over Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was actually her closer friend, who commanded the 1st South Carolina, because she told David Hunter that she would go along only if he put this man in charge. Now, she doesn't explain why, and we don't know why, and there's nothing in Hunter's records. By the way, there's nothing in his records either. Colonel Montgomery has a 1-paragraph description of the Combahee Raid. 1 paragraph. Now, Harriet Tubman doesn't figure in that paragraph. Neither do 300 other men who are in uniform figure in that paragraph. You know, they're like 2 other people. Captain so-and-so and Captain so-and-so led this contingent kind of thing. So in terms of understanding why, however, he would have been the one she would have preferred, a lot of it goes back to this other man, to John Brown, who's, I think, the feeling for whom it cannot be exaggerated, cannot even be expressed well enough, to the kind of symbol he was to African Americans at this time. This white man who was willing to sacrifice his life to court the worst possible dangers. And by the way, the man who nicknamed Harriet Tubman General Tubman. That's what he thought of her military skills and her military prowess. Harriet Tubman, after her petition, she submitted her petition for 30 years. By the way, one of the men who served under her, and this is another kind of corroborating and interesting piece of evidence, she lists in her petition for her military honors 6 or 7 or 8 men by name who were the men she commanded. I commanded a team of scouts, here are their names. Now, separately, and there's no indication that they kept in touch at all, one of those men later also petitions the U.S. Congress. His name is Walter Plowden. And Walter Plowden says, I went upriver many times. This is how I did it. I went upriver in a rowboat. We infiltrated Southern Territory. We came back with intelligence to give to General David Hunter, et cetera, et cetera. He, by the way, was captured before the war was over and was imprisoned in Charleston. He does not mention anybody's name other than his own, right? Well, okay, it's his story. Harriet Tubman mentions all of these names, including Walter Plowden. Now, Walter Plowden is granted a pension as a military scout. You know, essentially the terms of that. Harriet Tubman is granted, and by the way, so also in her application it says, this is General Rufus Saxton, he says she was a spy who made many a raid inside the enemy's lines and was invaluable as a scout. She was eventually granted her petition once she was a very old woman, 30 years about after the war. And this, by the way, I know it sounds strange, she was a little luckier than the Hello Girls of World War II, World War I. It took them 60 years. So after 30 years, Harriet Tubman is granted a pension as a nurse. Now, a man who served under her, by her word, and there's no reason to doubt her word at all, was granted a scout's pension. And I think it's because of this selective perception, selective attention thing. There was just no way that the U.S. government could wrap its mind around the idea that this woman was a commander in the American Civil War. So they're willing to acknowledge that Civil War military service by men. For a woman, it's got to be because she was just a rock star washerwoman and nurse. So lastly, to summarize